The Girl Who Inherited the Falls, Part 1. The weight of nothing. The rain came down the way grief does not all at once, but in a slow, relentless pour that soaked through everything and left nothing dry. It was the 14th of October, 1883, and the town of Millhaven, Virginia, stood gathered in the mud of Callaway Hill Cemetery, their black coats slick and heavy, their breath rising in small, pale clouds above the open grave of Edmund Holt. He had not been a large man in life, not large in stature, not large in reputation, not large in the way men of Millhaven measured one another by the acreage they worked the timbers, they sold the credit they carried at Dunmore's general store. Edmund Holt had been a trapper and a loner, a man who walked the ridgeline trails before dawn and came home after dark, who spoke in single sentences and smiled only when he thought no one was watching. Now he was a pine box being lowered into rocky Appalachian soil, and the town had come not so much to mourn him as to observe the final quiet closing of a life they had never quite understood. Clara May Holt stood at the edge of the gathering, not beside the grave, not in the front row where family belonged. She stood at the outer ring of mourners beneath a bare-limbed chestnut tree, her wool coat darkened with rain, her hands folded in front of her. She was 18 years old, and she had the kind of stillness about her that didn't come from peace, it came from practice. From years of learning how to be present in a room without taking up space that others thought was not hers to take. Her two half-brothers stood at the graveside, Harlan Holt, 32, thick through the shoulders with their father's jaw and none of his restraint, and Wade Holt, 29, quieter than his brother, but no less certain of his place in the world. They were the sons of Edmund's first wife, Constance, dead these 20 years. Clara was the daughter of his second, Margaret, dead these 9. Neither brother had looked at Clara since the service began. She did not blame them for it exactly. Blame requires a kind of energy she had long since stopped spending on Harlan and Wade. What she felt instead was something older and more settled, a recognition of the particular loneliness of being the child who does not quite belong to the family she was born into. The preacher said his words. The gravedigger stood back. The rain continued its patient work. And Clara May Holt watched her father's coffin disappear into the earth and said goodbye to the only person in the world who had ever looked at her as though she were exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not cry, not then. Grief, she had learned, was not a thing that happened at the graveside. Grief was what found you at 3 in the morning when the house was quiet and you reached for something that was no longer there. The mourners dispersed in clusters, ducking under hats and umbrellas, moving back toward the warmth of town. No one stopped to speak to Clara. A few of the older women, Mrs. Dunmore, Mrs. Peck, glanced her way with that particular expression that women of a certain age reserve for girls they feel sorry for but cannot quite bring themselves to help. Clara met their eyes and gave them nothing, and they moved on. Harlan passed close by her on the way out. He did not stop, but he slowed just for a moment, and she saw something move across his face, not warmth, not quite, but something complicated. Something that might have been the beginning of guilt had he allowed it to go any further. He didn't. He pulled his hat down against the rain and walked on. Wade didn't look at her at all. She stayed until the gravediggers had finished, until the mound of fresh-turned earth was complete and the rain had begun to smooth its edges. She placed her hand flat against the wooden marker plain pine, no carving not yet, and she stood there for a long moment with the sound of the mountain all around her, the wind through the bare trees, the distant rush of Holt Creek somewhere below. Then she straightened her coat, picked up her father's old leather satchel from where she'd set it against the chestnut tree, and walked back down the hill toward Millhaven. She had 2 days before the reading of the will. She spent them in the livery stable at the edge of town where old Garfield Moss let her sleep in an empty stall in exchange for mucking out the others each morning. It was not comfortable, but it was warm, and it smelled of hay and horses and honest work, which was more than she could say for most places she had slept in recent years. Her father's mule Gideon was stabled there as well, the one living creature she had been told in a brief and businesslike note from Harlan that she was permitted to claim before the formal proceedings. The mule was old 17 years at least, with a gray muzzle and long-lashed eyes that held the particular wisdom of animals who have outlived several owners. He pressed his nose into her palm when she came to him, and she rested her forehead against his and breathed. She had known Gideon her whole life. He had been her father's before he was hers. Those 2 days in the livery had their own particular texture. The mornings were cold and smelled of manure and fresh straw, and Clara worked through them, methodically cleaning stalls and hauling water, and talking to Gideon in the low, purposeless way you talk to an animal when you need the sound of your own voice to confirm that you still exist. The afternoon she spent sitting in Gideon's stall with her father's satchel open on her knees, going through its contents slowly, the way you go through a house you are about to leave for the last time. There was not much. A small hand axe with a hickory handle, its blade kept sharp in the way Edmund kept everything, not to display competence but because a dull blade was an insult to the work. A tin of matches in an oilskin wrap, a spare length of rope, good hemp 40 feet, a folded paper that turned out to be a rough sketch of the trail from Millhaven to the High Ridge, with distances noted in Edmund's small, careful hand, a piece of charcoal wrapped in a cloth, and at the very bottom of the satchel, wedged into the corner as though placed there deliberately, a small wooden bird, a wren carved with the particular attention to detail that Edmund brought to the things he made in private. Clara turned the wren over in her hands. She had never seen it before. It was old, the wood had darkened with handling over many years, but she had never once in her 18 years seen her father produce it or put it away. He had kept it in the satchel he carried on his trail work, which meant he had carried it with him every day for what might have been decades, through every season of trapping and climbing and walking the ridge, and she had not known. She set it on the ledge above Gideon's feed bucket and looked at it in the lantern light. It looked back at her with the miniature, precise confidence of a thing made by someone who knew exactly what they were making and why. On the morning of the 16th, she brushed the straw from her coat, tightened the leather strap on her satchel, and walked to the office of Ira Wentworth, attorney at law. The office was on Millhaven's Main Street, wedged between the post office and a dry goods merchant. It smelled of old pepper and beeswax polish, a thick, close scent that seemed to have been accumulating in its walls for decades. A small coal stove in the corner pushed out meager heat. The clock on the wall ticked with the patience of a man who charged by the hour. Harlan and Wade were already seated when Clara arrived. They occupied the two good chairs in front of Wentworth's desk, their hats in their laps, their posture carrying the easy confidence of men who already know how a story ends. Clara took the single wooden chair against the wall, the one that was slightly lower than the others, the one that had clearly been placed as an afterthought. Ira Wentworth himself was a lean, precise man of about 50, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the kind of face that gave nothing away on principle. He had been the town's lawyer for 23 years and had sat through enough readings of wills to have developed a professional immunity to the emotions they produced in others. He opened the document without ceremony. The will of Edmund Reginald Holt, he read, dated the 3rd of March, 1883. Clara noticed the date, March, 7 months before Edmund died. He had written this will in early spring when the snow was still retreating from the high ridges, when the first bloodroot was pushing up through the leaf litter on the forest floor. He had been alive and walking his trails in March. Why had he written his will so early? The question settled in her mind without an answer, and she let it stay there. Wentworth read on. To his sons, Harlan James Holt and Wade Calloway. Holt Edmund bequeathed the 40-acre homestead on the south slope of Spruce Ridge, the cabin, the barn, all outbuildings, the wagon, the team of draft horses, all traps and tools, the remaining timber, rights on the north lot, and all livestock save one. Everything of practical value. Everything that meant survival in a place like Millhaven in a year like 1883. Harlan exhaled slowly. Wade allowed himself the smallest of satisfied nods. Wentworth turned his gaze to Clara. To his daughter, Clara May Holt. Edmund Holt bequeathed his sole remaining parcel of land, that which is known locally as Holt Falls, comprising the waterfall and the gorge below, together with all rock face, pool, and mist, arising therefrom, extending 50 feet from the source of the falls in all cardinal directions. The room was very quiet, and then Wentworth paused. He turned the document over slightly, as though something written there had caught his attention. He had seen it before, of course. He had reviewed this document many times, but Clara noticed that he cleared his throat before he read the final line, as though it required a different register, as though it was not quite the same as the rest. He read, May she find in its voice the peace I never could. And should she seek what the water conceals from those who do not listen, let her follow where the water hides the scar. Harlan snorted. It was a short, dismissive sound, the sound of a man filing something away, under the category of eccentricity. Wade shook his head slightly, not at the words, but at the general situation of having a father who would write such things in a legal document. Clara did not move. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and she held those words inside her like a coal she had just picked up, too hot to examine yet, but too important to set down. Let her follow where the water hides the sky. She had stood at Holt Falls exactly 4 times in her life. She knew the way the white water dropped 100 feet off the black rock face. She knew the mist that rose from the pool in the mornings catching the early light. She had never thought to look for what the water might be hiding. Wentworth completed the formalities. Documents were signed. Harlan's pen moved with the authority of a man accustomed to putting his name on things. Wade signed more carefully, as though the act of writing required concentration. When the papers reached Clara, she signed her name in the clear, steady hand her father had taught her. Edmund had insisted she learn to write well, had drilled her on it by firelight through winters, when they had nothing else, and she set the pen down and rose from her chair. That was when Harlan looked at her directly for the first time since the funeral. He was not unkind about it. That was the complicated thing about Harlan Holt. He was not a cruel man by nature. He was a practical one, which in certain circumstances amounts to the same thing. He said quietly so that Wentworth at his desk could not quite hear, "You should sell it, Clara May. Vance would take it off your hands. It's rocks and noise. It won't feed you." She looked at him. At the face so like her father's but missing the particular quality she had loved most in Edmund, Holt, that deep searching attentiveness, the look of a man who was always listening for something just beyond the range of ordinary hearing. She said it was his, and she walked out into the pale October light. The street was muddy from 2 days of rain, the boardwalk slick underfoot. Clara stood for a moment on the top step of Wentworth's office, letting her eyes adjust to the gray brightness, letting the cold air settle the warmth that had built in her chest during the reading. The kind of warmth that precedes not tears but decision. She had expected nothing, and she had received something she did not yet understand, which was she was beginning to think not entirely different from what Edmund Holt had always given her. She was crossing the main street when she heard her name. Not her whole name, just Miss Holt. She turned. Cornelius Vance was standing on the boardwalk in front of the Millhaven Savings and Trust. His hat tipped at a precise angle, his coat a cut too fine for a town like this, his smile carrying the particular warmth of a man who has never needed to manufacture sincerity because he has never needed sincerity at all. He was perhaps 45, lean-faced with pale gray eyes that assessed everything they landed on in terms of its convertible value. He had come to Millhaven 3 years ago from somewhere East Richmond, some said, or further Philadelphia, and in 3 years he had bought 4 parcels of land, consolidated 2 timber operations, and made himself indispensable to enough of the town's commerce that people had stopped asking too many questions about the manner in which he did business. He said her name again and crossed the street toward her with the unhurried stride of a man who does not need to hurry because the world in his experience waits. "Miss Holt, I was sorry to hear about your father. Edmund Holt was a man this valley will not soon replace." Clara waited. Vance continued, "I understand the estate has been settled, and I understand you've come into possession of the Holt Falls parcel." He said it the way a man might say, "I understand you've come into possession of a broken axle and 3 feet of bad rope. I want you to know," he said, "that I have a genuine interest in that land. Sentimental almost. The falls are a landmark, a piece of this valley's character. I'd hate to see it sit unattended." He paused, letting that particular phrase unattended do its quiet work. "I would offer you $20, he said, "cash today, which I think we can both agree is a generous consideration for a piece of land that in practical terms cannot be farmed, logged, or milled." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the gray eyes and the precise hat and the coat that cost more than her father had earned in a year, and she said, "It's not for sale, Mr. Vance." His smile did not waver, but something behind it shifted the way ice shifts over deep water, a surface adjustment that conceals a structural change. He said, "I understand sentiment, but sentiment doesn't keep you warm in January." She said, "Neither does $20. And she crossed the rest of the street and did not look back. She collected Gideon from the livery and led him to the water trough at the edge of town and stood there while he drank her hand on the worn leather of his halter, her eyes on the ridge to the north where Holt Falls lay invisible, behind the tree line audible on still days from certain spots at the edge of town. She did not know what she was going to do. She knew only that the answer to that question was not $20 and Cornelius Vance's satisfied expression. She was still standing there when she heard the voices. They were coming from the narrow alley between the Savings and Trust and the adjacent building, a covered passage where deliveries were made, and apparently where certain conversations were conducted under the assumption that the street noise would cover them. It did not entirely. She did not move closer. She did not need to. Vance's voice, precise and unhurried, she'll come around. They always do when the alternative is sleeping in a barn. And Harlan's voice, lower, rougher, carrying something that might have been discomfort. She's stubborn, like him. Vance, $50 is more than enough to make stubbornness uncomfortable. Give her a week, then talk to her again. Make her understand that the offer won't stand indefinitely. A pause. Harlan. She signed the papers this morning. Vance papers can be superseded by circumstances. Everyone has a price, Harlan. Some people just need longer to discover what it is. Clara stood at the water trough and listened to the sound of her future being discussed in a delivery alley, and she felt something settle in her chest, not anger exactly. Something colder and more durable than anger. The kind of resolve that doesn't announce itself. The kind that simply becomes part of how you stand. She was still standing that way when she heard a different voice entirely. Old and dry and rustling like leaves that have been on the ground long enough to forget they were ever part of a tree. The voice came from the porch of the last cottage before the road out of Millhaven, a small, low-roofed house with a kitchen garden, going brown in the October cold, and a rocking chair occupied by a woman so still she might have been part of the architecture. Agnes Whitmore was perhaps 70, perhaps older. She had been in Millhaven so long that she seemed less like a resident than a feature of the landscape, like the rock outcroppings on the high ridge or the particular bend in Holt Creek, where the water ran shallow over white stones. She knew things about this valley that predated the memory of every other living person in it, and she shared those things sparingly and without explanation. Her knitting needles had gone still. Her eyes, sharp and dark beneath white brows, were fixed on Clara with an expression that was not sympathy and was not pity. It was something more like recognition. Clara had not been intending to stop, but she stopped. Agnes said without preamble, "Your father was not a man who wasted his words or his work." Clara waited. The old woman looked out toward the ridge, the direction of the falls, her needle still in her lap. She said, "Some men build walls to keep the world outside. Your father built something different, something that would keep most people out and let the right one in." She paused. "The question I find myself wondering," she said, "is whether you are the right one." She did not look at Clara when she said it. She looked at the ridge, and then her needles began to move again, and the conversation was apparently over. Clara walked on, but she carried the words with her the way you carry something unexpectedly heavy, not in your hands, but in your center, shifting your balance without quite knowing why. What door could be made of water, and who was the right one meant to enter it? She had no answers. She had a mule and a satchel, and a deed to a waterfall. She had her father's voice in her mind reading a line from his own will, "Let her follow where the water hides the sky," and she had the particular stubbornness that Harlan Holt had correctly identified as an inheritance from Edmund, though not the one inscribed in any legal document. That was enough to walk on. She found Calhoun Pruitt on the trail north of town about a quarter mile before the path split toward the high ridge. He was leading a gray mare with a wrapped foreleg, moving slowly, talking to the horse in the low, even tone of a man who has spent enough time with animals to know that they respond to the quality of a voice more than its content. He was perhaps 25 spare and weathered in the way of men who work outdoor land, with a quiet face and the unhurried manner of someone who has never found occasion to rush. He saw Clara and Gideon on the path and stopped. He looked at her with direct, uncomplicated attention, not the way the men in town looked at her, measuring her situation, but simply the way one person looks at another when they're trying to determine if they're all right. She was not all right particularly, but she was upright and moving, which at that moment was the same thing. He said, "You're Edmund's daughter." She said, "I am." He said, "Calhoun Pruitt. My land runs up against the northeast corner of the Holt Falls parcel." He paused. "I heard about the will." Everyone had heard about the will. Millhaven was not a large town. He said, I knew your father a little. Not well, but my father knew him better. He said, and here Calhoun paused as though measuring whether to continue, then continued. He said, Edmund Holt used to go up to the falls alone at night, long after dark, sometimes when the weather was bad. My father asked him about it once. Edmund said it was where he went to think. He said this as though it were a piece of information he had been carrying without knowing who it belonged to and had now found the right person to give it to. Clara looked at him. She said, Did your father say anything else? Calhoun considered. He said, Edmund always looked different coming down from the falls than he did going up, calmer, like he'd put something down that he'd been carrying. They stood on the path for a moment with the mountain quiet around them and the wounded mare shifting gently on her wrapped leg. Then Calhoun said, I'm going as far as the ridge cut off. If you're heading up, you're welcome to company for that stretch. Clara said, I am. They walked together in the comfortable silence of people who do not feel compelled to fill space with words. He helped her with Gideon's pack where the path narrowed and the footing turned uncertain on wet rock. When they reached the cutoff where the trail divided his way east toward the Pruitt land, her way north toward the falls, he stopped. He said, If you need anything up there, I'm not far. She nodded. He said, The path gets loose about 50 yards before the gorge. Your mule knows it better than the ground does. Trust him. Then he turned east with his gray mare and was gone around the bend, and Clara continued north alone with Gideon. The trail to Holt Falls was old and narrow, more game path than road threading between dense stands of hemlock and yellow birch, already stripped of their leaves by the October winds. The air grew colder and damper as she climbed, and before she saw anything, she heard it, the low, distant percussion that grew, as she ascended, building from a rumor to a fact, from a sound to a presence. By the time she and Gideon emerged from the tree line onto the rocky outcrop above the gorge, the falls were not a sight so much as a force. 100 feet of white water dropping off the black face of the ridge into a stone-lined pool below, sending up a constant curtain of cold mist that coated every surface and turned the moss a deep luminous green. It was powerful and remote and utterly indifferent to her arrival. Clara stood at the edge of the outcrop and looked at the place her father had left her. The gorge was steep-walled and shadowed the ground at its base, a jumble of moss-covered boulders and thin, acidic soil where only ferns and hardy weeds could get purchase. There was no flat land to pitch a tent that would stay dry, no pasture for Gideon, no soil deep enough for a garden. The water ran too fast and too shallow for a mill. It was, in all practical terms, exactly what everyone had said it was: a view. And a view was a thing for people who already had a window. She had no window. She had this. Gideon had been walking steadily beside her the entire way, accepting the terrain with the equanimity of long experience. But now, at the edge of the gorge, with the sound of the falls filling the world, he stopped. His feet went still on the rock. His long ears moved, not pinned, back in fear, not swiveling with the generalized attention of an animal processing its environment, but fixed. Aimed with deliberate precision at a point behind the main cascade of water, slightly to the north, where the fall was thickest and the mist rose heaviest, and the black rock face disappeared behind a constant shifting curtain of white. He stood like a compass, finding north. Like an animal who has already resolved the question that the human beside him has not yet thought to ask. Clara watched him for a moment. Then she shifted her gaze to the spot his ears were aimed at. She saw nothing but falling water and rising mist in the dark shape of the ridge behind it. She began to make a small camp on a patch of ground between 3 large boulders that provided some shelter from the direct spray. The work was hard, and the ground was uncooperative, and by the time she had her canvas shelter anchored and her fire lit a thin, reluctant thing that sputtered in the damp, the light was going, and the temperature was dropping, and the sound of the falls was a constant, overwhelming presence that pressed in on all sides. She ate a small supper of cold biscuit and hard cheese, and sat by her fire and looked at the falls turning silver in the last of the light. It was not a peaceful sound. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. People said falling water was soothing. It was not soothing. It was relentless. It was a physical force that worked its way through the rock and into the soles of her feet, a vibration that settled in her back teeth and would not be quiet. At night, she suspected it would fill her dreams in ways that left no room for rest. She was thinking these things sitting close to her sputtering fire when she heard boots on rock. Harlan came down into the gorge from the north approach the way you came if you were familiar with the land and knew the easier grade. He was not alone. Behind him was a man Clara did not know, younger than Harlan, carrying a satchel with the flat-wide tools of a surveyor's trade. Harlan stopped a dozen feet from her fire. He looked at the camp she had made at Gideon, tethered to a boulder at Clara sitting on her rock with her supper in her hands. His expression was complicated in the way it had been at the cemetery, not cruel but practical in a way that had decided a long time ago to stop being troubled by what practicality required. He said, "I'm asking you one more time, Clara May. Take the money and let this go." She said no. He said, "You can't live here." She said, "I'm living here now." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face, that incomplete thing she'd seen at the graveside, the beginning of guilt, that never quite arrived. Then he looked at the surveyor, and the surveyor began to make notes in his log, and Harlan turned and climbed back out of the gorge without another word. Clara watched him go. She sat by her fire for a long time after listening to the falls in the darkness, and she was thinking about nothing in particular, letting the sound work on her, the way it had worked on her father all those years when she became aware of something else beneath the roar. It was subtle, the kind of thing you would never hear if you were listening for it. You had to stop listening, had to let the sound become background instead of foreground, had to let your attention go soft and wide instead of pointed and searching. And then underneath the constant crashing percussion of the water, there was something else, a hollow note, a resonance that did not match the rest, darker and more bounded, like the sound of a room inside a larger room, like a drum struck inside a cave. It was faint. It might have been nothing. It might have been her exhausted mind finding patterns in chaos. But Gideon's ears moved toward it again. That same deliberate pointing aimed at the spot behind the thickest fall where the mist rose heaviest and the black rock hid behind white water. Clara set down her cup. She looked at where her mule was looking, and for the first time since her father had been put in the ground, she felt something that was not grief and was not despair and was not the cold, sustaining fuel of stubbornness. She felt the precise and particular alertness of a person who has just realized that the question they have been asking is the wrong question entirely, that the inheritance was never what anyone in Millhaven said it was, that her father, who had been a man of single sentences and long silences and deep patient attention, had not left her a waterfall. He had left her a direction, and the direction was listen. She did not yet know for what. But she was 18 years old and she was her father's daughter, and she had learned at his knee that the most important things in this world do not announce themselves. They wait for the person who is willing to be still enough and patient enough and stubborn enough to hear them. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold coming off the water. She settled in. She listened. Part 2, What the Water Hides. The first week at Holt Falls was a study in the particular misery that comes not from catastrophe, but from accumulation, not one large, unbearable thing, 100 small ones. The damp that never left. The fire that never quite caught the way it should, always sputtering at the edges, always threatening to go out, entirely requiring constant attention and still producing more smoke than heat. The cold that worked its way through the wool of her coat by mid-morning and stayed there until she slept and was waiting again when she woke. The sound of the falls that pressed in at all hours, not peaceful, not terrible, just relentlessly present, like a companion who never stops talking and never says anything you can use. Clara worked. That was the only answer she had found for any of it. She worked from the gray light before dawn until the gray dark after dusk, and the work was not grand or purposeful in any way she could name. It was the grinding, necessary labor of making a place habitable that had not been designed for habitation. She built a second rock wall to channel the worst of the spray away from her tent. She dug a small drainage trench along the uphill edge of her camp to redirect the groundwater that crept toward her sleeping roll each night. She gathered fallen timber and split it with the small hand axe from her father's satchel, stacking it under an overhang of rock where it might dry a little in time if the weather allowed. She checked the 3 snares she had set along the upper creek and found them empty for 4 days running. Before the 5th morning, produced a single rabbit which she cleaned and cooked over her fire and ate slowly and with complete attention, because when food is scarce, you stop eating absent-mindedly. Gideon was her steadiest companion and her most reliable barometer. The old mule had adjusted to the gorge with the philosophical resignation of an animal who has been in enough unusual situations to understand that most of them eventually resolve. He ate the rough grass she found for him along the upper trail, drank from the pool at the base of the falls, and spent his days in a posture that was the animal equivalent of watchful waiting, head up ears, mobile eyes, patient. And every afternoon without fail in that particular window, when the wind died down and the air went still before the evening chill set in, he would take up his position on the flat ledge of rock above the pool and fix his attention on that same spot he had found on the first evening. That place behind the heaviest fall, slightly north of center, where the water was thickest and the mist rose without pause. He would stand there for an hour or more, ignoring the patches of good clover she found for him on the upper slope, his ears pointed with the settled certainty of an animal that has already done the work of deciding. Clara watched him during these vigils, but did not yet know how to use what she was seeing. She had been raised by a man who trusted animals, and she had absorbed enough of that to know that when Gideon pointed at something with that quality of attention, the question was never whether something was there. The question was only whether she was paying enough attention to see it, to see. On the ninth day, Calhoun Pruitt came up the trail from the east with a sack of flour over one shoulder and a look on his face that suggested he had been trying to decide whether to come for several days before deciding. He set the flour down near her fire without ceremony and looked at the camp she had made, the rock walls, the drainage trench, the stacked wood, with an expression that was not quite admiration, but was something adjacent to it, the particular appreciation of one practical person for another's practical work. He said, "You've done more here in 9 days than most men would in a month." She said most men would have sold it. He looked at her with that direct, uncomplicated attention of his. Then he looked at the falls. He said, "My father used to say your father was the best reader of land he ever knew. Said Edmund could look at a piece of ground and tell you what it wanted to be, not what you wanted to make it." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did your father ever go up to the falls with him?" Calhoun shook his head. He said Edmund always went alone, but my father watched him go and come back many times over many years. He said, and Calhoun paused in the way he did when he was deciding how much weight to put on something. He said Edmund carried things differently after he'd been up here, like the weight had redistributed itself. Gone from somewhere it was hurting him to somewhere he could manage. Clara looked at the falls. She thought about a man who came here in the dark and in bad weather and came back changed by it, and she thought about the line in the will, "Let her follow where the water hides the sky," and she thought about the hollow sound she had heard on that first night beneath the roar, like a room inside a room. She said, "Did he ever mention anything specific about this place? Anything about what was here?" Calhoun considered. He said, "Only one thing I remember. My father asked him once what he was looking for up at the falls at night. And Edmund said Calhoun stopped to retrieve the exact words from wherever he'd been keeping them. He said, 'I'm not looking for anything. I already found it. I'm just checking on it.'" The words settled between them in the cold air. Clara looked at Gideon on his ledge, ears fixed and certain. She said almost to herself, he already found it. Calhoun stayed through the noon hour, helping her reposition the main rock wall and cut a better drainage channel along the eastern edge of the camp. He worked without direction, reading the ground the way a man does who has spent his life on it. And when they stopped to eat her hard biscuit and dried venison, his contribution of a good wedge of sharp cheese they ate in the comfortable silence of people who do not feel the need to fill every space with sound. Before he left, he paused at the edge of the gorge and looked up at the cliff face beside the falls. He stood there for a moment with the considering expression of a man doing geometry in his head. He said, "If there was something behind that water, you'd need a way to get to it without killing yourself." She said, "I know." He nodded once and went back down the east trail, and she watched him go and felt the particular appreciation you feel for a person who understands when to say a thing and when to let it stand. On the 11th day, she found the path. She had been sitting on a rock above the pool with a piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper from her father's satchel, doing what he had always done when he was trying to understand a piece of land, sketching it. Not artistically, practically. The way a man draws a map to find where he is in relation to where he needs to go. She was rendering the rock face beside the falls the way the stone was layered, the patterns of seepage and stain on its surface when she noticed that the moss was wrong. not wrong in a way that would register if you were simply looking at the cliff. Moss grew on cliff faces. That was what moss did. But when you were drawing it, when you were tracing its patterns with a piece of charcoal and giving your full attention to the way it distributed itself across the stone, you began to see what was accent and what was structure. And the structure of this moss, the deepest green, the most densely established growth, was not random. It moved in a line, not a straight line, a zigzag switching back and forth across the rock face, angling upward from the pool toward the north face of the cliff, toward the place behind the heaviest fall where Gideon had been pointing for 11 days. It was faint enough that you would never see it if you were not looking for it. It was the kind of thing that required you to already be asking the right question. But once she saw it, she could not unsee it. She set down her charcoal. She went to the cliff face and crouched where the mossy line began, at a point just above the water line at the edge of the pool. She looked closely at the rock, and there, half hidden by a natural lip of stone, partly obscured by decades of growth, she found it. A mark. Small, precise cut into the rock with a sharp tool. A single vertical line bisected by two short horizontal ones, like a simplified letter H, or like a specific notch in a specific pattern. She had seen that mark 10,000 times in her life, on the wooden handles of traps, on the corner posts of property markers, on the back of the rough furniture Edmund built in the long winter evenings when there was nothing to do but work with his hands, on the base of the small carved wren at the bottom of his satchel. It was her father's mark, his personal maker's signature, the one he had carved into everything he owned or made or wanted to be able to find again. He had put it here, at the beginning of the mossy path on the cliff face. Not recently, the lichen had grown over the edges of the cut, which meant years. Perhaps many years. He had been maintaining this path for a long time. He had cut this mark at the trailhead so that the right person would know where to begin. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the path she had just found and the mark that began it, and she felt the full weight of what she was understanding settle over her slowly, the way cold water rises, not all at once, but inevitably. Her father had not simply left her a waterfall. He had left her a trail. He had been leaving it for years, cutting it, tending it, keeping it navigable and marked while presenting to the town of Millhaven and to his own sons the unaltered appearance of a poor, solitary trapper who had nothing to offer anyone. A memory surfaced from somewhere deep. A winter evening by the fire, her father's hands busy with a piece of wood, his voice low and raspy from a season's cough. She couldn't have been more than 8. She had asked him why their cabin door was so heavy and hard to open, and he had smiled the smile he only used when he was about to say something he had been saving. The best doors, he had said, are the ones you have to learn to see. The door without hinges. Clara May. The path made of something that grows. The sound that doesn't belong. She stood up. She looked at the path. She looked at Gideon on his ledge, still pointing at the same place he had been pointing for 11 days, patient as stone. She said to him quietly, "You knew the whole time, didn't you?" The mule blinked his long, lashed eyes and did not dignify this with a response. She began to prepare. It took her 2 days to do it properly, and she did not rush it because her father had not been a man who rushed anything that mattered. And she was beginning to understand that she was walking in the full length of his footsteps here. She used Gideon to drag a long fallen pine from the upper slope, a task the mule undertook with a resigned competence that suggested he had done similar work before. And with her hand axe, she cut deep notches across the top of the log at regular intervals, creating handholds where the surface would otherwise be too slick to trust. She positioned it across the most treacherous section of rock at the water's edge, pinning it between 2 boulders so that it bridged the worst of the spray zone without shifting underfoot. She cut steps into the softer sections of the approach with the flat edge of the axe. She drove a wooden peg into a crack in the rock at the base of the climb and tested it with her full weight until she was satisfied it would hold. Then she took the longest rope she had, 40 feet of good hemp, the best her father's satchel had held, and tied one end around her waist with a bullion knot her father had taught her, and the other end around the base of a cedar that had been growing in this gorge long enough to have roots deeper than she could see. She looked at the cliff face. She looked at the mossy path. She looked at the place it led. She began to climb. The spray hit her within the first 3 steps. Not gradually, completely, The mist at the base of the falls was not mist in any gentle sense of the word. It was a horizontal rain driven by the force of 100 feet of falling water, and it soaked through her coat and her shirt and her skin in the time it took her to find the second handhold on the rock face. The cold was immediate and total. Her fingers pressed into crevices in the stone went from cold to numb to something past numbness, a buzzing, unreliable sensation that made it difficult to know how hard she was gripping. She moved slowly. She tested every hold before she trusted it. She kept her body close to the rock, the way her father had taught her to move on uncertain ground. Not reaching, not committing, before you were certain, letting the mountain tell you where it was willing to hold you. The rope pulled gently at her waist, a constant reminder of the cedar at the bottom that was not going anywhere. The sound was colossal. At the base of the falls in the open gorge, the roar had been overwhelming. Here on the rock face within arm's reach of the cascade itself, it was something beyond sound. It was pressure. It was weather. It was a force that pressed against her eardrums and her skull and the inside of her chest, leaving no room for thought, no room for fear, no room for anything except the next handhold, the next foothold, the next 6 inches of cliff face. She moved in inches. The mossy path was real. It had been made by someone who knew what they were doing. The line of deeper growth always led to the best holds, always avoided the sections of crumbling rock or treacherous algae, always found the angles of approach that minimized exposure and maximized security. She was climbing a path that someone had spent years designing for exactly this purpose. She was following her father's mind up the face of a cliff in the middle of a waterfall. And then her left hand closed around an edge of rock that was dry. Dry stone in the middle of all that water. Solid warm by comparison, rough with natural grip. Her fingers, numb and buzzing, recognized it before her mind did. A different texture, a different temperature, a different quality of contact. She pulled. She got her right hand to the same ledge. She found a foothold below it that was wide and certain. She straightened her arms and lifted herself and pulled her body over the edge and onto a shelf of rock 3 feet wide and deeply shadowed, and the spray dropped away behind her like a curtain falling, and the sound, the colossal, all-consuming roar became background. She lay on the ledge for a moment, just breathing. The shelf was real. It was level, more level than natural stone had any right to be, and when she ran her hand along its surface, she could feel the faint regular marks of a tool that had worked it flat. Chisel marks. Patient, unhurried, applied over a long time by a man who was in no hurry, because the work itself was the point. She got to her feet. The ledge led into shadow. The shadow deepened into darkness. The darkness opened into something that was not quite a cave. She found the matches and the small lantern in her oilskin pouch. Her hands were barely functional, the cold having worked deep into the joints of her fingers, and the first match scraped and died without catching. The second flared and held. She touched it to the wick, and the lantern bloomed with warm light, and she lifted it and looked. It was not a cave. It was a room. A small room no larger than a trapper's line shack, perhaps 12 feet by 14, with the raw stone of the mountain for its back wall, in its ceiling and its northern flank. But the wall that faced the waterfall, the wall that was from the outside, simply more cliff face, simply more rock and shadow behind the falling water, was built. Riverstone laid in careful courses fitted without mortar, in the old way so tight that not a draft moved through the joints. Fitted timbers framing a low doorway, a narrow window sealed with oiled hide, a shelf of flat stone serving as a sill. The floor was sawn plank, thick, smooth fitted, as carefully as the stonework laid over a base of tamped earth and gravel that had kept it level and dry through what must have been decades of mountain winters. In the corner, a cast iron stove, no bigger than a bushel basket, its chimney pipe running up through a natural crack in the ceiling that served as a flue. Beside the stove, a stack of split wood dry and ready, a cot against the stone wall, a wool blanket folded with military precision at its foot, a table, a chair, a lantern hook, and shelves. The shelves were everywhere, from the floor to the ceiling, on every wall that was not stone, and on the stone wall itself, wooden brackets had been driven into natural crevices to hold additional rows. They were filled in a way that stopped Clara's breath entirely, not because of their number, but because of what they held. Books, dozens of them, their spines worn and faded, their pages swollen slightly with the years, but intact, protected by the dry air of the sealed room. Natural histories, botanical surveys, geological studies, a complete set of Audubon's bird volumes and worn leather covers. Journals, perhaps 30 of them, uniform in size, bound in dark calfskin, standing in precise chronological order. Specimen tins labeled in her father's small, careful hand-and-seed names. Collection dates, locations given by ridge name and elevation. Glass jars holding preserved insects. Beetles with their elytra spread, moths with their wing patterns intact. Mayflies still perfect after years in clear alcohol. Wooden boxes lined with cotton, batting containing ordered rows of stones, feathers, pressed leaves, dried flowers. A collection, a life's work, a record of this valley from the ground up, from the smallest insect to the patterns of weather across the high ridge, assembled over decades by a man the town of Millhaven had filed under the category of poor trapper and left there. On the table, one large journal lay open. Beside it, a sealed envelope. Two words on the envelope in the handwriting she knew better than her own. For Clara May. She crossed the room. She sat in the chair. She set the lantern on the table and looked at the open journal page before she touched the envelope, needing a moment. Needing the evidence of him, before the words of him, needing to see his hand in the drawings on the page rather than hear his voice in the letter. The drawings were extraordinary. She had known her father could draw. She had seen him sketch in the margins of things on scraps of paper in the dirt with a stick. But she had never seen him draw like this. The page before her held the detailed anatomical rendering of a red-tailed hawk in flight, every primary feather. Individually described the skeletal structure, visible beneath a transparent overlay. The eye caught in a moment of absolute focus that she recognized because she had seen it before in a different face, looking at the world with the same quality of attention. Her father had drawn himself into the eye of a hawk. She broke the seal on the envelope. The letter inside was short. Edmund Holt had never been a man for excess words. My daughter, if you are reading this, you listened. I knew you would. Not because you are obedient, you never were, and I was always glad of it, but because you are patient, and patience is the rare gift. The world saw a trapper. I let them. It was easier in a place like Millhaven, in a time like this, for a man with no formal schooling and no family money to be what people expected him to be and do his real work in the margins. I was never ashamed of what I was, but I was always something more than what they saw, and I chose to do that something more here, where the water kept the careless out and brought only the careful in. Everything in this room is yours, not as property, as knowledge. 31 years of this valley, its creatures, its plants, its soils, its weather, its hidden water, and its visible rock. There are species in these jars that no one has formally recorded. There are maps in these journals that no surveyor has made. There is a drawing in volume 14 of an orchid that grows in one single crack of rock on the high black ridge that I have never been able to find described in any book I own. This is what I had to leave you. Not the land, what the land taught me. And one more thing, look in the leather case on the bottom shelf behind the Audubon. I made arrangements 6 months ago with a judge in Staunton. The room and everything in it is legally recorded as a protected natural and scientific collection under Virginia statute. Cornelius Vance cannot touch it. No one can without your permission. I was never the man Millhaven thought I was. I hope you were never the girl they thought you were either. Your father, who loved you more than he ever found the right words for, but tried to build something that said it instead. Edmund Holt, April 3rd, 1883. Clara sat in the chair for a long time after reading it. Outside, the waterfall roared on as it had roared for 10,000 years, before Edmund Holt had built his room behind it and would roar for 10,000 years after. Inside the room, everything was still and dry and ordered and smelling faintly of old paper and pine resin, and the specific irreplaceable scent that she had associated with her father her whole life and had been trying since the 14th of October not to notice the absence of. She wept, not with grief. Grief was what she had been carrying since the cemetery on the hill. This was different. This was the feeling of a weight you have been carrying so long, you forgot it was there, finally being set down. This was the feeling of being known by someone who was no longer present to know you, and discovering that the knowing outlasted the person, that it was built into the walls and the shelves and the careful, patient accumulation of a lifetime's work. She had not been left nothing. She had been left everything. She wept until the feeling completed itself, which took a long time, and Then she dried her eyes with the back of her hand and opened the journal to the first page and began to read. She read through the afternoon. The light through the oiled hide window changed from pale afternoon gray to the deeper gray of evening, and she lit a fire in the small stove, and the room became warm for the first time, warm and dry and alive, with the soft sound of the fire finding its rhythm in the iron box and the steady, constant voice of the waterfall outside the wall, which she was only now in this new context beginning to hear for what it was. Not a prison, not a torment, not the sound of loss. A door. The sound of a door that only opened for people willing to listen long enough to find it. She was still reading when she heard faintly above the roar a different sound from the world outside. She set the journal down and looked at the narrow window. She rose and went to the wall and found at eye level what she had not noticed in her first amazed inventory of the room, a small, precise hole bored through the stone at a slight downward angle, no bigger than her thumb, fitted with a hinged wooden cover. A peephole drilled by the same patient hands that had drilled everything else in this room, positioned to give a view of the gorge below, through the curtain of falling water. She opened the cover and put her eye to it. The world outside was visible in a narrow vertical slice, slightly distorted by the water moving in front of it. The pool at the base of the falls, the far bank of the creek, the game path that came down from the north approach. Two figures were on that path, Harlan and a man she did not know, not the surveyor from before, someone different, someone whose build and bearing and the particular way he moved through the land suggested a profession that was less about measuring and more about enforcing. They stopped at the edge of the creek. Harlan pointed at the gorge, at the falls, at the cliff face. The other man looked where he pointed, his face expressionless, and made a note in a small book. Clara watched through the peephole in her father's wall until they turned and went back up the north path. Then she closed the cover and stood in the warm firelit room and thought about Cornelius Vance, who had paid Harlan $50 and sent a different kind of man up here this time. Not a surveyor, someone else. She thought about the leather case on the bottom shelf behind the Audubon volumes. She crossed the room and crouched and pulled the case out. It was flat like a portfolio sealed with a leather strap. Inside were documents, 3 pages of dense legal language in the formal type of an official record, stamped with the seal of the Circuit Court of Augusta County, Virginia, and signed by a judge in Staunton. Edmund Holt had been very thorough. She read the document, slowly making sure she understood each provision. The collection was legally protected. The room was legally established as a site of scientific and cultural significance. Any attempt to destroy, remove, or impede access to its contents was actionable under Virginia property law. Vance could not touch it. He could not buy it from her without her consent. He could not compel it, pressure it, or legislate it away. He could send all the surveyors and all the hard-faced men he wanted to the gorge, and he would find nothing but a waterfall and a girl who had stopped being impressed by hard-faced men sometime around the age of 12. Clara set the document back in the case. She put the case back on the shelf. She returned to the table and the open journal, and she read until her eyes could not hold the words any longer. Then she banked the fire in the small stove and wrapped herself in the wool blanket from the cot, the blanket that smelled unmistakably of her father, and she lay down and listened to the waterfall on the other side of the wall. It was not a lullaby exactly. It was too large and too constant for something so gentle. But it was, she realized, a kind of language, a language she had been hearing her whole life without understanding, and was only now in this room that her father had built and filled and legally protected and left to her, with a trail of moss and a maker's mark on a stone and a mule who knew which way to point his ears, only now beginning to translate. He had come here in the dark, in the bad weather, for 31 years. He had come here to do his real work. Outside, the falls roared on. The sound pressed against the stone wall and moved through it, softened, redistributed, becoming not noise but texture, not force but presence. Inside the fitted stone walls, in the dry, warm air that smelled of old paper and pine resin, there was only the sound of a banked fire settling into its own quiet, and a young woman finally still enough to hear what the silence inside the noise had always been saying. Clara Mayholt slept in her father's room for the first time, and she slept without grief, and she slept without fear, and she slept like a person who has finally, after a very long journey, arrived somewhere that was waiting for her. Part 3, What He Left Behind. The storm came down from the high ridge on the 3rd of November, 1883. The way the old-timers in Millhaven said the worst ones always did not, with warning, not with the gradual darkening and freshening wind that gave you time to prepare, but all at once, as though the mountain had been holding it back by main force and simply decided to let go. Clara felt it coming the evening before, not in the sky, which was clear and cold and salted with stars. She felt it in the air itself, a particular stillness, a held quality like the breath before a shout. Gideon felt it too. He would not settle. He moved in circles at the end of his tether, his hooves restless on the rock, his ears in constant motion reading frequencies she could not hear. She trusted him. That was the inheritance of 11 years watching her father trust animals, the understanding that their unease was information, not noise. She spent the evening making ready. She brought Gideon up the north trail to a deep overhang of rock. She had found in her first week of exploring the gorge's edges a natural shelter where the cliff face jutted out far enough to create a dry space 10 feet deep, protected from three sides. She brought his feed, his water, in a sealed tin, his worn blanket. She spoke to him in the low, even tones she had learned from her father, and he pressed his gray muzzle into her hand before she left him. And she stood there for a moment in the cold dark, with her hand on his jaw, feeling his warmth against her palm. Then she went back down to the gorge, crossed the log bridge, climbed the mossy path, easier now, deeply familiar, her hands finding the holds without thought, and sealed herself into her father's room, with the fire banked high and the wood stacked close and the leather case of legal documents moved from the bottom shelf to the inside of her father's satchel, which she kept on the cot beside her. The storm arrived at midnight. She heard it before she felt it, a sound that began below the frequency of the waterfall, something lower and broader, a bass note that the mountain itself seemed to produce as the pressure changed across its ridgeline. Then the wind hit the gorge, and the sound of Holt Falls changed completely. The falls had been in the weeks she had lived beside them a constant, loud yes, relentless yes, but consistent, the same roar at the same pitch with the same rhythm, as reliable as a clock. Now the wind drove into the gorge from the northwest, and the water sheeted and twisted, and the sound became something else entirely chaotic, layered a dozen different voices in the same throat, none of them steady. Then the rain came, and the rain was not rain in any ordinary sense. It was a horizontal force, a wall of water moving sideways through the gorge, and within an hour she could hear the creek below rising. Not the polite rise of ordinary rain, but the sudden decisive surge of a waterway, receiving the runoff of an entire mountain range simultaneously. By morning, Holt Falls had become something she did not have a word for. The 100 feet of white water she had come to know was now 300 feet wide, a solid moving mass of gray-brown water that swallowed the pool below and spread across the rocks and filled the gorge with sound that was past loud, past deafening, past the category of sound entirely, and into the category of weather. It shook the stone around her. It pressed against the fitted wall of her father's room, and she felt it in her sternum, and in the joints of her hands, and in the place behind her eyes where fear lives when it has nowhere else to go. The room held. Edmund Holt had built for exactly this. The courses of fitted stone did not shift. The sawn plank floor did not buckle. The chimney pipe sang in the wind, but held its angle, and the fire burned steadily, and the air inside remained dry and still and warm, a separate country from the fury outside the wall. She read. She tended the fire. She ate sparingly from the provisions she had brought in: dried beans, hard biscuit, a small piece of salt pork. She read her father's journals by lantern light, and she listened to the storm dismantle the world outside, and she was frightened for Gideon, and grateful for the room, and aware with a clarity that the contained intensity of the situation produced that she was exactly where her father had intended her to be. The first day passed, the second day passed. On the third day, the rain eased from a wall to a curtain, and in that slight reduction of fury, she heard something she almost missed. A voice, not the wind, not the water, not the thousand variations of sound that the storm had been producing for 2 days. A human voice, high, ragged, torn apart by the noise, almost before it formed, but unmistakably human, unmistakably desperate. She was at the peephole before she had consciously decided to move. Through the narrow vertical slice of distorted vision past the altered falls across the swollen creek that was no longer a creek, but a river 15 feet across and running fast and brown, she saw them. A woman and a boy. The woman was perhaps 30, her dark dress plastered against her, her hair loose and streaming. The boy was small, 6 maybe 7, pressed against her side with both arms around her waist, his face turned into her coat. They were huddled against the base of the cliff on the far bank in a shallow notch of rock that was giving them perhaps 3 feet of shelter from the driving rain. 20 yards to their left half in the water lay the wreckage of a wagon. One wheel still spun. The axle was broken cleanly, a fast water crossing, attempted and lost. They had been there from the look of them for some time. The woman's posture was past fear into that particular stillness that follows fear once the body has spent everything it has on adrenaline and has nothing left but endurance. Clara looked at the creek between them. It was impassable on foot. The water was moving too fast and running too deep. There was no crossing it by walking and no bridge. Her own log bridge was on the south side of the gorge, inaccessible from their position, and she could see from the debris moving in the current that it had likely been shifted or destroyed by the surge. She looked at the distance, 40 feet perhaps 45 from the ledge of rock at the base of her father's wall to the far bank where they were sheltering. She had rope, she had 40 feet of good hemp, and she had the cedar at the base of the climb, and she had grown up watching her father solve problems, not with the resources he wished he had, but with the ones he actually had. She moved. She opened the door of the room, the low-fitted door in the fitted stone wall, and stepped out onto the ledge behind the falls. The force of the altered water hit her immediately, not mist now, but spray with the weight of something purposeful soaking her before she had taken 3 steps. The noise was beyond anything she had words for. She pressed herself against the cliff face and moved along the ledge to the northern end, where the overhang of rock gave a few feet of shelter from the direct force of the falls. She could see them clearly from here. The woman had seen her. She was standing now, one arm still around the boy, the other raised her mouth, moving in words that the noise swallowed entirely. Clara held up her hand. Wait. She went back into the room for the rope. She tied one end to the iron ring her father had set into the base of the cliff wall. She had wondered about that ring when she first found it. A heavy iron ring driven into the rock at knee height beside the door, with no obvious purpose. Now she understood its purpose completely. Edmund Holt had thought of everything. She paid out the rope across the ledge and felt its length. 40 feet. The distance to the far bank was 45, perhaps more. She needed more reach. She went back into the room and looked at the cot. The frame was lashed together with braided cord, her father's work tight and deliberate, and she spent 3 minutes. She did not have unwinding 6 feet of it from the frame, tying it to the end of the hemp, with the best joining knot her father had taught her, testing it with both hands until she was satisfied. Back on the ledge, she weighted the rope's end with a stone from the shelf, a flat river stone from her father's collection, smooth and heavy, and wrapped it twice around the end with the remaining cord tying it off. She looked at the distance and the angle. She looked at the current and where it would carry the weighted end if the throw was short. She threw. The wind took it. The weighted end arced out and dropped short into the current, and the current took it, and she hauled it back hand over hand, the wet rope burning her palms, and she threw again. This time the woman was ready. She had understood. She was standing at the water's edge, too close, dangerously close, with her arms out and her eyes on the rope. The weighted end landed at her feet, and she grabbed it with both hands. Clara braced herself against the cliff face, both feet set wide, the rope across her hip, the way her father had taught her for exactly this kind of work. Not gripping with the hands, which would fail, but anchoring with the body, which was stronger and more reliable. She nodded at the woman. The woman understood. She tied the rope under the boy's arms. He was crying. She could see it in his face, even if she couldn't hear it. His mother said something to him that lasted 10 seconds, and then she kissed his forehead and stepped back. Clara pulled. It was the hardest physical work she had ever done. The boy was slight, but the current was not, and where the rope crossed the water, it caught the force of the flow, and the angle worked against her, and her boots slid on the wet rock, and she set her teeth and found another inch of grip and pulled. The boy came across the water, kicking one hand on the rope and one arm over his head, the current pushing at him, but the rope holding its line. And then he was at the near bank, and Clara was reaching down with one hand to grip his collar and haul him up onto the rock, and he was shaking so hard she felt it through her palm. She put him behind her against the cliff, face out of the worst of the spray. She threw the rope back. The woman caught it on the first throw. She was capable, and she was ready, and she tied it under her own arms with efficient, unsentimental speed, and then she waded in without hesitation, the current slamming into her immediately and nearly taking her feet. But she kept the rope taut, and she walked herself, hand over hand, along it, while Clara held the anchor and the water tried to take her. She made it. She came up over the edge of the rock, and Clara gripped her arm, and they stood there together for a moment in the noise and the spray, neither of them speaking. And then Clara said into the woman's ear as loudly as she could, "There's shelter. Come." She led them along the ledge, the woman's arm around the boy, Clara in front, with her hand on the cliff face. Through the door, into the room. The woman stopped just inside the threshold and stood dripping on the plank floor, and looked at the firelight and the warm air and the shelves and the stove and the cot with the wool blanket on it, and her face did something complicated that had grief and relief and disbelief all moving through it at the same time. Her name was Beulah Alderman. She told Clara this when she could speak, which was not immediately. She spent the first minutes wrapped in the blanket from the cot, with her son pressed against her side, both of them shaking steadily in the particular way of people whose bodies are processing cold that has gone in deep. Clara stoked the stove without being asked. She put water on to heat. She gave them the last of the hard biscuit and the remainder of the salt pork, and she sat on the floor across from them and let the warmth build. The boy's name was Henry. He was 7. He had stopped crying and was now in that state that children reach after sustained terror, a kind of blank, wide-eyed calm, his head against his mother's arm, his eyes moving slowly around the room. They stopped on the glass jars of specimens. They stopped on the bird drawings pinned to the stone wall. They stopped on the neat rows of journals on their shelves. He said in a small voice, barely audible above the diminished roar of the storm, "Is this a library?" Clara looked at him. She said, "Something like that." Beulah said, "How did you—" She stopped, tried again. "How is there a room here?" Clara said. "My father built it." Beulah looked at the fitted stone wall, at the iron ring at the chimney pipe, running up through the natural fissure in the ceiling, at the evidence of decades of patient, deliberate work. She said, "He built this behind a waterfall." Clara said, "He did." Beulah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why?" Clara considered. She looked at the shelves, at the journals, at the open page of the volume she had been reading the previous evening, a detailed account of the migratory patterns of a particular warbler species across the Appalachian Ridge, observed over 22 consecutive springs. She said he wanted a place where the work could happen without interruption. She was still forming a fuller answer to that question when the peephole caught her attention. She rose and crossed to it and opened the cover and put her eye to it, not knowing what had drawn her instinct or the change in the storm's quality or something less nameable, and she saw him immediately. Cornelius Vance. He was on the near bank, not the far bank where Beulah and Henry had been. The near bank, the gorge side, which meant he had come down from the south approach, the way she herself came and went. He was moving along the creek's edge toward the base of the cliff face, his fine coat destroyed by 2 days of rain, his hat gone, his pale gray eyes scanning the rock face with the focused intention of a man who has been thinking about a specific problem for a long time and has finally decided to stop thinking and act. He was looking for the room. He had sent the hard-faced man to look, and the hard-faced man had come back with nothing, and Vance had apparently decided that the only way to find what he was certain must exist was to look himself. He moved along the creek's edge too close to the surging water, his eyes on the cliff face. He was scanning from south to north, which was the correct direction. He was working toward the spot where the moss path began, where Edmund's maker's mark was cut into the stone. He was close. He was methodical. He would find it given enough time and enough nerve to approach the cliff face in this water. And then the water made the decision for him. The surge came without warning, a secondary wave from upstream, where something had given way, a log jam or a bank that had been holding and let go. It came down the gorge in a 4-foot wall that swept the near bank clean, and Vance went into it sideways. Not gracefully, not in any way that suggested he had expected it. He went in with his arms out and his mouth open, and the current took him immediately, rolling him once, and deposited him against a wide, flat boulder in the middle of the creek that stood high enough above the waterline to catch him and hold him. He was alive. Clinging to the rock with both arms, his face white, the water churning around him on three sides. Clara stood at the peephole for a long moment. She thought about Cornelius Vance standing on the boardwalk in front of the Savings and Trust with his hat at a precise angle and his voice carrying across the street for everyone to hear. She thought about him in the alley behind the post office, telling Harlan that everyone has a price. She thought about the hard-faced man he had sent to her gorge, the man with the noting pad and the evaluating eyes. She thought about the bridge she had found with its timbers nearly cut through. She thought about her father's legal documents in the leather case and the satchel on the cot. Then she took the coil of rope down from the hook by the door and went back out onto the ledge. She made her way to the northern end of the shelf, where the overhang gave some shelter, and she looked across the water to the rock where Vance was clinging. He had seen her. His pale eyes were on her face with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not calculation, not assessment, not the managed warmth of a man who sells things. Just a man on a rock in a flood, looking at the only other person in the world. She weighted the rope in. She threw. Her first throw was short. The wind was still strong and the angle was difficult. She hauled it back and threw again, and this time it landed across the rock, and Vance grabbed it with one hand and then both and held on. She set her feet and anchored the rope across her hip. She said nothing to him. There was nothing to say that the rope wasn't already saying. She simply held her position and let him work himself along the line through the current. And when he reached the near bank, she leaned down and took his arm. Not with warmth, not with coldness, simply with the practical grip of one person pulling another out of fast water, and she got him up onto the rock. He stood in front of her, soaked and shaking 10 years of Cornelius Vance, stripped away by 2 days of storm and 30 seconds in a flooded creek. And he looked at her with those pale eyes that were not in this moment calculating anything at all. She said, "There's a fire inside." She brought him in. The room was crowded now with improbable occupants, a woman and her small son wrapped in a blanket on the cot, a shivering land speculator standing in the doorway dripping on the plank floor, and Clara Mayholt, 18 years old, feeding wood into a small cast-iron stove, while the storm raged against the stone wall on the other side. Vance stood just inside the threshold for a long moment. His eyes moved across the room with the automatic inventory of a man who values things, and then they slowed. Then they stopped. He looked at the shelves the way the boy Henry had looked at them, with a gradual widening of attention that was not acquisitive, but simply receptive, the expression of someone encountering something they do not have an existing category for. He moved to the nearest shelf and stood before it without touching anything. He read the spine of a journal. He looked at the specimen tins with their careful labels. He looked at the drawings pinned to the stone wall, the hawk, the maple leaf, the detailed anatomical rendering of a brook trout with its lateral line described in precise notation. He picked up the closest journal, the first volume dated 1852, the year Edmund Holt had come to this valley, and opened it. He read for perhaps 3 minutes. Clara watched him read. She watched him turn the pages slowly, which was not how Cornelius Vance did anything. She watched his face while he read her father's 31-year-old words about this gorge, this creek, the specific light on the ridge in early April, the first appearance of a migratory species in a particular stand of hemlock. He closed the journal and set it back carefully, precisely in the gap where it had stood. He said not to Clara specifically, but to the room. He did all of this alone. It was not a question. It was a man arriving at the end of a calculation he had not expected to be making. Clara said, "He did." Vance was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled in the stove. Beulah Alderman's boy had fallen asleep against his mother, his face finally at rest. The storm outside continued its work, slightly diminished, now working itself toward its own end. Then Vance said, "I came here looking for something to take." Clara said nothing. He said, "There is nothing here I could take." He said it with the particular flatness of a man who has made his living knowing the value of things and has just encountered the first thing in a long time that he cannot price. She let the statement stand. She did not agree with it, and she did not forgive him for what he had been trying to do, and she did not perform graciousness she did not feel. She simply let the statement stand in the warm, firelit air and turned back to the stove. The storm broke on the afternoon of the 5th day. It did not end gradually. It ended the way it had begun, decisively, the mountain releasing it the same way it had released it, a structural change in the air that dropped the wind to almost nothing within the span of an hour, and left the sky a pale wash blue behind retreating cloud. Clara emerged from the room onto the ledge and climbed down to the gorge and stood in the first sunlight in 5 days, her face tilted up to it. The gorge was transformed. The creek was still high, but dropping its color, clearing from brown to green. The pool at the base of the falls was enormous, its edges reaching far into the boulders. Trees were down on the upper slope. The log bridge was gone, carried away sometime in the first night, she guessed from the scour marks on the rocks where it had been anchored. Gideon was safe. She found him in the overhang shelter, unchanged by the experience, in the philosophical way of Mose eating the last of the feed she had left him, with the focused contentment of an animal whose needs have been met, and who requires nothing further from the situation. She pressed her forehead to his and felt him breathe. Beulah Alderman's husband found his way to the gorge by mid-morning of the following day, led by the sound of his wife calling from the near bank. He was a lean, weathered man named George, who had spent 3 days covering the valley, looking for his family with the systematic desperation of someone who will not stop until they have an answer. When he saw them, his wife on the bank, his son beside her, both alive and whole, he sat down on the wet ground and put his face in his hands for a long moment before he got up and crossed the creek at the shallow ford a quarter-mile north. He shook Clara's hand without words. His grip said everything the words would have been inadequate for. The Aldermans went back to Millhaven. Vance left that same morning before the Aldermans, alone taking the North Trail, with the careful steps of a man whose confidence in his own footing has been recently revised. He stopped at the edge of the gorge and looked back at Clara, who was standing at the base of the cliff face in the morning light. He said, "I'll not trouble you again, Miss Holt." One sentence. No elaboration, no qualification. He said it with the specific simplicity of a man who has decided on a course and does not intend to revisit it, and then he turned and went up the North Trail and was gone around the bend. Clara watched him go. She was still standing there when she heard a different set of boots on the North Trail. Not Vance's careful steps, heavier, more familiar. Harlan came down into the gorge alone. No surveyor, no hard-faced man, just her half-brother in his work coat, his hat in his hands. He stopped at the edge of the pool and looked at the cliff face for a long moment, at the approach she had cut the cedar peg and the rope system she had rigged, and something moved in his expression that she recognized as the thing that had been trying to become guilt since the cemetery, and had finally, in whatever private process he had been working through, arrived. He said, "I knew about the trust. Wentworth told me when he told me about the will." He paused. "I could have said something to you that day in the office." She waited. He said, "I didn't. And I've been sitting with that for 3 weeks. He stopped. "I'm not asking you to think well of me for staying out of Vance's way these last days or for not using what I knew against you. I just wanted you to know that I knew and I didn't use it, and that's the most I had to offer." He looked at her steadily with a directness she had not seen in him before. Not the sideways practicality he usually brought to dealings with her, but something more exposed and therefore more true. She looked at her half-brother, at the face so like her father's and so unlike him, at the weight he was carrying in the set of his shoulders, the weight of a man who had made a practical decision in a hard moment and had spent 3 weeks understanding what that decision had revealed about him. She said, "I know Harlan." She did not say it warmly, but she said it honestly, and they both understood the difference, and that was enough. Not forgiveness, that was a longer road than either of them was standing at the beginning of yet, but acknowledgement. The recognition that complicated people sometimes do the less bad version of the thing they might have done, and that this is worth noting even if it is not worth celebrating. He put his hat back on. He looked at the falls for a moment, at the curtain of white water, the mist rising from the pool, the dark cliff face behind it all. He said quietly, almost to himself, "He came up here his whole life and never told any of us what he was doing." Clara said no. Harlan was quiet for a moment longer. "Then I think I understand that now." He glanced at her. Not all of it, but some of it. He turned and went back up the North Trail, and she watched him go. The same way she had watched Vance go, without anger, without easy forgiveness, with the quiet regard she was learning to hold for people who did the best they could with who they were and came up short in ways they couldn't entirely help. She stood in the gorge for a long time after, in the quiet that followed the storm, a quiet that was not silence because the falls were still roaring and the creek was still running and the birds were beginning to reappear in the trees above the gorge, announcing their survival to one another, with the cheerful urgency of creatures who have no interest in pretending that coming through a hard thing is not worth noting. 3 days after the storm, they came from Millhaven. Not all of Millhaven, but enough of it to matter. The aldermans had told their story, and the story had moved through the town the way water moves through limestone, finding every crack, filling every space, coming out changed but still itself. It had moved from the alderman household to their neighbors, from the neighbors to the general store, from the store to the church steps and the post office in the livery, where old Garfield Moss heard it and passed it on to everyone who came to collect their horses. They came up the trail in a loose procession, a dozen people, maybe more, in heavy coats and sturdy boots, picking their way through the storm-clean landscape with the careful steps of townspeople on unfamiliar terrain. Garfield Moss was among them. The widow Peck and Mrs. Dunmore, whose pitying glances Clara had walked away from in October. 3 farmers from the valley floor whose names she knew, but whose faces she had barely registered before today. And Ira Wentworth, the lawyer who came with a leather satchel and a look of focused purpose that was different from his professional blankness, the look of a man attending to something that had been waiting for him. Clara met them at the edge of the gorge. She said nothing. She simply led them along the path she had cleared over the new crossing she had built to replace the lost log bridge. 2 days' work begun the morning after the storm, sturdier and better than the first one, and onto the mossy approach and up the cliff face. They climbed slowly. She helped them where the holds were difficult. She said when she needed to, "Put your left hand here. Watch that section, it's slick." She brought them through the falls, one by one. The collective sound they made when they entered the room, not a gasp, not a word. Something between the two was, Clara thought, exactly the sound her father had deserved to hear during his lifetime and had chosen to forgo. She felt something about that which was not quite grief and not quite anger and not quite pride. Something that didn't have a name, but that she recognized as hers. They moved through the room slowly with the instinctive care of people who understand without being told that they are in the presence of something that cannot be replaced. Garfield Moss stood for a long time before the geological specimens with the expression of a man who has spent his life in a landscape he has never been formally introduced to. Mrs. Dunmore picked up a seed tin and read the label and set it back down with a gentleness that Clara had not seen in her before. Agnes Whitmore had come. Clara had not expected her. The trail was not easy, and Agnes was not young, but there she was, the last through the falls, helped across the wet section by 2 of the farmers who clearly regarded assisting her as something close to a civic duty. She came into the room and stood in the middle of it and was still for a long time, her dark eyes moving across the shelves with the expression of someone not discovering something new, but recognizing something long known. She said to the room, to Edmund, to whatever it is that the dead still occupy in the spaces they filled in life, "You always did say you were going to build something that lasted." Clara stood near the door and watched the old woman's face. Agnes turned to her. She said, "He talked about a library. In all the years I knew him before the world decided what he was, and he let them, he talked about building a library. Not a grand one, a useful one. A record of what was actually here in this particular place so that it wouldn't be forgotten when the people who knew it were gone." She looked at the shelves. She said, "I suppose he found his own way to do it, as he generally did." Clara said, "How long did you know him?" Agnes said, "Since before he came to this valley." She paused. "He was 17 when I met him, already reading everything he could find, already keeping notes on things other people walked past without seeing." She paused again, and in the pause was the particular weight of a long friendship carried quietly, of a secret kept faithfully over decades out of respect for the person who had asked for it. He was never what Millhaven thought he was. But this valley, she made a small gesture that took in the room and the falls outside and the gorge and the ridge beyond this valley, got the true version of him. Every morning for 31 years, I think that's not a bad accounting. The town of Millhaven went home in the afternoon light, taking with them the particular recalibration that comes from discovering that the world contains something you had not accounted for. The whispers going back down the trail were different from the whispers that had accompanied the reading of the will, not the brisk dismissal of a community filing away an inconvenient fact, but something slower and more searching. The sound of people revising what they thought they had known. Ira Wentworth stayed last. He sat in the chair at the table, Edmund's chair, but Wentworth sat in it with the careful diffidence of a man who knows he is a visitor and opened his leather satchel and laid a document on the table beside the open journal. He said, "Your father came to my office on the 4th of April, 1883, the day after he signed the protective filing in Staunton. He left these instructions with me." He indicated the document. Clara looked at it. It was a trust instrument. Simple, precise, in Edmund's own handwriting, formalized into legal language by Wentworth's careful pen. A sum of money not large, $240, the accumulation of many years of small sales and careful saving, held in trust for Clara May Holt to be released 30 days after the reading of Edmund's will, on the condition that Clara had taken possession of the Holt Falls parcel and had not sold or agreed to sell it within that period. 30 days. She had been here for 32. She looked at the figure. $240 was not wealth, but it was a winter. It was seed for a garden in spring. It was timber for improvements to the room materials, for a proper staircase up the cliff, face tools and provisions that would carry her through to the season when the work could expand beyond survival. She looked at Wentworth. She said, "He knew exactly what he was doing." Wentworth said, "Your father was one of the most deliberate men I have known in 30 years of practice. He knew precisely what he was doing, and he planned it over many years with considerable care." He paused, and something in his precise professional face shifted slightly, the trained blankness giving way to what was, she thought, genuine feeling offered briefly, and then returned to its usual housing. "He said he spoke of you often, Miss Holt, in the conversations we had about these arrangements. He said Wentworth stopped, retrieved the exact words. He said she will find it if I show her where to start, and she won't need me to tell her what to do once she has." Clara sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Was there anything else?" Wentworth said, "One thing. He asked me to tell you when the time came that the orchid in volume 14 is real. He was not certain he had described it accurately enough for someone else to find it, but he believed you would know where to look." He closed his satchel and rose from the chair and took his leave with the understated courtesy of a man who understands that he has delivered what he came to deliver and that the room now belongs to someone else. Clara listened to his footsteps cross the ledge and diminish down the cliff face. Then it was quiet as this room ever got, which was not silent because outside the fitted stone wall the falls roared on, and the creek ran its changed course through the changed gorge, and the birds in the hemlock above called their late afternoon calls. But it was a quiet of a different quality. It was the quiet of a place that has found its purpose and settled into it. Calhoun Pruitt came the following morning with lumber. He arrived at the base of the cliff face with 2 cedar planks over his shoulder and a sack of iron hardware, and the information that he had 3 more planks on a sledge at the top of the north approach. And would Clara like help building a proper staircase up the cliff face, because the current arrangement was, in his professional assessment, as a man who had been falling off things since childhood, a hazard. She said yes. They worked for 3 days on the staircase, fitting the cedar planks into the rock face with iron brackets, cutting new and deeper holes where the old ones were insufficient, building a railing of twisted hemp stretched between iron rings sunk into the stone. Calhoun worked with the same spare competence he brought to everything. No wasted motion, no unnecessary comment, a steady and reliable presence that asked nothing from her except the practical information required to do the work well. On the first day, while they were fitting the lower section of the stair, she told him about the room. She told him about the journals and the specimens and the legal documents and the letter. She told him about Edmund's 31 years of coming here in the dark and the weather to do the work he could not do in the light. She told it plainly, the way you tell something that does not require ornamentation, because the facts themselves are sufficient. Calhoun listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, fitting a bracket into the stone with the careful attention he brought to things that needed to be right. He said, "My father knew there was something up here. He just didn't know what." She said, "Your father's observations were useful data even without the conclusion." He looked at her sideways. It was the first time she had seen him almost smile. On the second afternoon, while they were fitting the upper section of the stair, he said, "I looked at volume 14 last evening." She had given him reading access, as she had given it to anyone from the town who wanted to come and sit in the room and use the collection. She had decided this quickly and without much internal debate, because it was the obvious continuation of what her father had started, a record made to be used, not preserved in isolation. She said, "What did you think of the orchid?" He said, I think I've seen it. Up on the north face of the Black Ridge, about 300 feet below the summit, in a south-facing crack in the granite, last summer. I didn't know what it was. She looked at him. He said I could take you up there when the snow goes. She said I'd like that. They worked in silence for a while after that, fitting the last planks into place, while the falls roared beside them, and the November sun moved in its low arc across the ridge. It was good silence, the silence of two people who are comfortable in the same space and do not need it to mean anything beyond that. That evening, she sat at her father's table with the lantern burning and volume 14 open before her. His description of the orchid was precise and careful, and drawn with his characteristic quality of attention, the drawing showing not just what the flower looked like, but what it was doing, how it was orienting to the available light in the narrow crack, how its roots were managing the thin layer of organic material in the granite crevice. Beside the drawing in smaller text than his usual notation, he had written, I do not know its name. I have not been able to find it described in any volume I own. Either it has a name I cannot locate, or it does not yet have one. In either case, it is here, in this specific place, doing what it does regardless of what anyone calls it. Below that, in the same hand but slightly different ink, added later, sometime after the first entry by a man returning to a note he had left himself. If anyone finds us who knows how to look for such things, the ridge bearing is approximately north 47. West from the base of the falls, and the crack is on the south face 12 feet below a distinctive double peak formation in the granite. The flower blooms in the late June. Do not take specimens. Let it continue to be what it is. Clara read this twice. She thought about her father climbing to that crack in the granite year after year in the late June heat to check on a flower that no one else knew existed. She thought about him deciding not to take a specimen, not to cut it from its place and preserve it in one of his careful glass jars, but to let it stay in the crack where it had learned to live and do its own obscure work in the available light. She thought about a man who had spent 31 years paying attention to a valley that had never once paid attention to him, and had not found this unjust, had not felt owed anything, for it had simply continued to look, because looking was what he did, and the valley was what was there to be looked at. She opened the new journal she had bought from Dunmore's general store on her last trip to Millhaven, the first of what she understood sitting here with the lantern in the falls, and 31 volumes of her father's work around her, would be many journals. She opened it to the first page. She wrote the date, November 9th, 1883. She wrote the location, Holt Falls, Augusta County, Virginia. Room behind the main cascade. Built by Edmund Reginald Holt, 1852 to 1883. She wrote, this journal is a continuation of the record. The previous 31 volumes are complete and will be preserved in the room where they were written. This volume begins where they end. She paused. She looked at the drawing of the orchid on the open page of volume 14. She looked at her father's note. It is here in this specific place, doing what it does, regardless of what anyone calls it. Then she wrote, volume 32 begins with an unresolved entry from the previous record, a species of orchid observed by Edmund Holt on the north face of the Black Ridge, not yet formally identified. Calhoun Pruitt, who farms the land to the northeast, has independently observed the same plant in the same location. In late June of next year, when the flower is in bloom, I intend to climb to the north face of the Black Ridge and determine what it is. She stopped. She looked at what she had written. She crossed out the last two words and wrote instead what it should be called. She set the pen down. She looked at the crossed out words and the replacement beside them, and she understood in the full and unhurried way you understand things that have been approaching you for a long time and have finally arrived what the difference was. Determining what something is assumes the name already exists and you only need to find it. Determining what something should be called is an act of a different order entirely. It is the act of a person who has decided that the world's record is incomplete and that completing it is their work. It is the act of a person who has accepted without drama and without grandiosity that this specific patch of the world is their responsibility to see clearly and to record faithfully and to pass on to whoever comes after. It was the act she recognized of her father's daughter. Outside the fitted stone wall, Holt Falls roared on in the November dark, as it had roared the night Edmund Holt first climbed this cliff face 31 years ago, with tools and riverstone, and a particular quality of patience that most people spend their whole lives being told is impractical. As it had roared through every winter of his secret work, and every spring of his careful return, and every summer of his quiet, unwitnessed attention to this valley. As it would roar through every year of what came next, whatever that turned out to be, whatever she made of it, whatever name she eventually gave to the flower on the ridge, and to the ones after it, and to all the unnamed things her father had seen but not gotten to. The water did not know about any of that. The water simply fell the way water always falls, not because it is trying to get somewhere, but because it is following what it is. Finding the lowest point and going there wearing the stone, smooth over time, making a place where the careful and the patient and the stubborn can come and do their work in peace behind a curtain that keeps out everyone who is not willing to listen long enough to hear what is behind it. She closed the journal. She banked the fire. She lay down on the cot with the wool blanket that smelled of pine resin and old paper and the specific irreplaceable scent that had been her father's and was now, in whatever way such things passed from one person to another, beginning to be hers. She listened to the falls. And the falls sounded as they had sounded every night since she first learned to really hear them, like exactly where she was supposed to be, not because she had been placed there by accident or by inheritance or by the failure of other options, but because she had listened when it mattered and followed where the listening led and built on what she found the same way her father had built, carefully and without hurry, one fitted stone at a time. The lantern burned low, the fire settled. Outside, the mountain went on about its ancient business in the dark. And inside the room behind the waterfall, Clara May Holt, 18 years old, lay still and quiet and awake for a few minutes longer, thinking about an orchid on a granite ridge that would bloom in June and about what she intended to call it when it did.